First Steps on the Path. Prologue. I bow before Govinda, the objectless object of final success in the highest wisdom, who is supreme bliss and the true teacher. For beings, a human birth is hard to win, then manhood and holiness, then excellence in the path of wise law. Hardest of all to win is wisdom, discernment between self and not self, true judgment, nearness to the self of the eternal, and freedom are not gained without a myriad of right acts and 100 births. This triad that is won by the bright one's favor is hard to gain. Humanity, aspiration, and rest in the Great Spirit. After gaining at last a human birth hard to win, then manhood and knowledge of the teaching, if one strives not after freedom, he is a fool. He suicidal destroys himself by grasping after the unreal. Who is more self-deluded than he who is careless of his own welfare after gaining a hard-won human birth and manhood too? Let them declare the laws, let them offer to the gods, let them perform all rites, let them love the gods, without knowing the oneness with the self. Freedom is not won, even in 100 years of the evolver. There is no hope of immortality through riches, says the Scripture. It is clear from this that rights cannot lead to freedom. Therefore, let the wise one strive after freedom, giving up all longing for sensual self-indulgence, approaching the good, great teacher, the higher self, with soul intent on the object of the teaching. Let him, by the self, raise the self, sunk in the ocean of the world, following the path of union through complete recognition of oneness, setting all rights aside. Let the wise, learned ones who approach the study of the self strive for freedom from the bondage of the world. Rights are to purify the thoughts, but not to gain reality. The real is gained by wisdom, not by a myriad of rights. When one steadily examines and clearly sees a rope, the fear that it is a serpent is destroyed. Knowledge is gained by discernment, by examining, by instruction, but not by bathing, nor gifts, nor 100 holdings of the breath. Success demands first ripeness. Questions of time and place are subsidiary. Let the seeker after self-knowledge find the teacher, the higher self, full of kindness and knowledge of the eternal. The 4 perfections. He is ripe to seek the self who is full of knowledge and wisdom, reason and discernment, and who bears the well-known marks. He is ready to seek the eternal who has discernment and dispassion, who has restfulness and the other graces. 4 perfections are numbered by the wise. When they are present, there is success, but in their absence is failure. First is counted the discernment between things lasting and unlasting. Next, dispassion, the indifference to self-indulgence here and in paradise. Then the 6 graces, beginning with restfulness. Then the longing for freedom. A certainty like this, the eternal is real, the fleeting world is unreal. This is that discernment between things lasting and unlasting. And this is dispassion, a perpetual willingness to give up all sensual self-indulgence, everything lower than the eternal, through a constant sense of their insufficiency. Then the 6 graces, a steady intentness of the mind on its goal. This is restfulness. And the steadying of the powers that act and perceive, each in its own sphere, turning them back from sensuality. This is self-control. Then, the raising of the mind above external things. This is the true withdrawal. The enduring of all ills without petulance and without self-pity. That is the right endurance. An honest confidence in the teaching and the teacher. This is that faith by which the treasure is gained. The intentness of the soul on the pure eternal. This is right meditation, but not the indulgence of fancy. The wish to untie by discernment of their true nature all the bonds woven by unwisdom, the bonds of selfishness and sensuality. This is the longing for freedom. Though at first imperfect, these qualities gradually growing through dispassion, restfulness, and the other graces, and the teacher's help, will gain their due. When dispassion and the longing for freedom are strong, then restfulness and the other graces will bear fruit. But when these two, dispassion and longing for freedom, are lacking, then restfulness and the other graces are a mere appearance, like water in the desert. Chief among the causes of freedom is devotion, the intentness of the soul on its own nature. Or devotion may be called intentness on the reality of the self. Let him who possesses these perfections, and who would learn the reality of the self, approach the wise teacher, the higher self, from whom comes the loosing of bonds, who is full of knowledge and perfect, who is not beaten by desire, who really knows the eternal, who has found rest in the eternal, at peace like a fuelless fire, who is full of selfless kindness, the friend of all that lives, serving the teacher with devotion and aspiration for the eternal, and finding harmony with him, seek the needed knowledge of the self. The appeal to the higher self. I submit myself to thee, Master, friend of the bowed-down world and river of selfless kindness. Raise me by thy guiding light that pours forth the nectar of truth and mercy, for I am sunk in the ocean of the world. I am burned by the hot flame of relentless life and torn by the winds of misery. Save me from death, for I take refuge in thee, finding no other rest. The great good ones dwell in peace, bringing joy to the world like the return of spring. Having crossed the ocean of the world, they ever help others to cross over. For this is the very nature of the great-souled ones, Mahatmas, their swiftness to take away the weariness of others, so the soft-rayed moon of itself soothes the earth, burned by the fierce sun's heat. Sprinkle me with thy nectar voice that brings the joy of eternal bliss, pure and cooling, falling on me as from a cup, like the joy of inspiration. For I am burnt by the hot, scorching flames of the world's fire. Happy are they on whom thy light rests, even for a moment, and who reach harmony with thee. How shall I cross the ocean of the world? Where is the path? What way must I follow? I know not, Master. Save me from the wound of the world's pain. The beginning of the teaching. To him, making this appeal and seeking help, scorched by the flame of the world's fire, the great soul beholding him with eyes most pitiful brings speedy comfort. The wise one instills the truth in him who has approached him longing for freedom, who is following the true path, calming the tumult of his mind and bringing restfulness. Fear not, wise one, there is no danger for thee. There is a way to cross over the ocean of the world, and by this path the sages have reached the shore. This same path I point out to thee, for it is the way to destroy the world's fear. Crossing the ocean of the world by this path, thou shalt win the perfect joy. By discerning the aim of the wisdom teaching, Vedanta, is born that most excellent knowledge. Then comes the final ending of the world's pain. The voice of the teaching plainly declares that faith, devotion, meditation, and the search for union are the means of freedom for him who would be free. He who is perfect in these wins freedom from the bodily bondage woven by unwisdom. When the self is veiled by unwisdom, there arises a binding to the not-self, and from this comes the pain of the world life. The fire of wisdom lit by discernment between these two, self and not-self, will wither the source of unwisdom, root and all. The pupil asks, "Here with selfless kindness, Master, I ask this question. Receiving the answer from thy lips, I shall gain my end. What is then a bond, and how has this bond come? What cause has it, and how can one be free? What is not self, and what the higher self, and how can one discern between them?" The Master answers, "Happy art thou. Thou shalt attain thy end. Thy kin is blessed in thee, for thou seekest to become the eternal by freeing thyself from the bond of unwisdom. Sons and kin can pay a father's debts, but none but a man's self can set him free. If a heavy burden presses on the head, others can remove it, but none but a man's self can quench his hunger and thirst. Health is gained by the sick who follow the path of healing. Health does not come through the acts of others. The knowledge of the real, by the eye of clear insight, is to be gained by one's own sight and not by the teachers. The moon's form must be seen by one's own eyes. It can never be known through the eyes of another. None but a man's self is able to untie the knots of unwisdom, desire, and former acts, even in the myriad of ages. Freedom is won by a perception of the self's oneness with the eternal, and not by the doctrines of union or of numbers, nor by rites and sciences. The form and beauty of the lyre and excellent skill upon its strings may give delight to the people, but will never found an empire. An eloquent voice, a stream of words, skill in explaining the teaching, and the learning of the learned, these bring enjoyment, but not freedom. When the great reality is not known, the study of the scriptures is fruitless. When the great reality is known, the study of the scriptures is also fruitless. A net of words is a great forest where the fancy wanders. Therefore the reality of the self is to be strenuously learned from the knower of that reality. How can the hymns, Vedas, and the scriptures profit him who is bitten by the serpent of on wisdom. How can charms or medicine help him without the medicine of the knowledge of the eternal? Sickness is not cured by saying medicine, but by drinking it. So a man is not set free by the name of the eternal without discerning the eternal. Without piercing through the visible, without knowing the reality of the self, how can men gain freedom by mere outward words that end with utterances? Can a man be king by saying, "I am king," without destroying his enemies, without gaining power over the whole land? Through information, digging, and casting aside the stones, a treasure may be found, but not by calling it to come forth. So, by steady effort, is gained the knowledge of those who know the eternal, the lonely, stainless reality, above all illusion, but not by desultory study. Hence, with all earnest effort to be free from the bondage of the world, the wise must strive themselves, as they would to be free from sickness. And this question put by thee today must be solved by those who seek freedom. This question that breathes the spirit of the teaching, that is like a clue with hidden meaning. Hear then, earnestly, thou wise one, the answer given by me. For understanding it thou shalt be free from the bondage of the world. Self-Potencies, Vestures. The first cause of freedom is declared to be an utter turning back from lust, after unenduring things, thereafter restfulness, control, endurance, a perfect renouncing of all acts that cling and stain. Thereafter the divine word, a turning of the mind to it, a constant thinking on it by the pure one, long and uninterrupted. Then, ridding himself altogether of doubt and reaching wisdom, even here he enjoys the bliss of nirvana. Then, the discerning between self and not self that you must now awaken to, that I now declare, hearing it, lay hold on it within yourself. The vestures, formed of the substances they call marrow, bone, fat, flesh, blood, skin, and overskin, fitted with greater and lesser limbs, feet, breast, trunk, arms, back, head. This is called the physical vesture by the wise, the vesture whose authority as I and my is declared to be a delusion. Then these are the refined elements, the ethereal, the upper air, the flaming, water, and earth. These, when mingled with one another, become the physical elements that are the causes of the physical vesture. The materials of them become the five sensuous things that are for the delight of the enjoyer, sounds and other things of sense. They who, fooled in these sensuous things, are bound by the wide noose of lust, hard to break asunder. They come and go, downwards and upwards on high, led by the swift messenger, their works. Through the five sensuous things, five creatures find dissolution to the five elements, each one bound by his own character. The deer, the elephant, the moth, the fish, the bee. What then of man, who is snared by all the five? Sensuous things are keener to injure than the black snake's venom. Poison slays only him who eats it, but these things slay only him who beholds them with his eyes. He who is free from the great snare, so hard to be rid of longing after sensuous things, he, indeed, builds for freedom, and not another, even though knowing the 6 philosophies. Those who only for a little while, rid of lust, long to be free and struggle to reach the shore of the world ocean, the toothed beast of longing lust makes them sink halfway, seizing them by the throat and swiftly carrying them away. By whom this toothed beast called sensuous things is slain by the sharp sword of true turning away from lust, he reaches the world's seashore without hindrance. He who, soul destroyed, treads the rough path of sensuous things. Death is his reward, like him who goes out on a luckless day. But he who goes onward to the word of the good teacher, who is friendly to all beings and himself well controlled, he gains the fruit and the reward, and his reward is the real. If the love of freedom is yours, then put sensuous things far away from you like poison. But love, as the food of gods, serenity, pity, pardon, rectitude, peacefulness, and self-control. Love them and honor them forever. He who every moment leaving undone what should be done, the freeing of himself from the bonds of beginningless unwisdom, devotes himself to the fattening of his body, that rightly exists for the good of the other powers, such a one thereby destroys himself. He who seeks to behold the self, although living to fatten his body, is going to cross the river, holding to a toothed beast while thinking it a tree. For this delusion for the body and its delights is a great death for him who longs for freedom, the delusion by the overcoming of which he grows worthy of the dwelling place of the free. Destroy this great death, this infatuation for the body, wives, and sons. Conquering it, the pure ones reach the Pervader's supreme abode. This faulty form, built up of skin and flesh, of blood and sinews, fat and marrow and bones, gross and full of impure elements, born of the fivefold physical elements through deeds done before, the physical place of enjoyment of the self, its mode is waking life, whereby there arises experience of physical things, subservient to physical objects through the outer powers with its various joys, flower chaplets, sandal, lovers. The life makes itself like this through the power of the self. Therefore, this form is preeminent in waking life. But know that this physical body, wherein the whole circling life of the spirit adheres, is but as the dwelling of the Lord of the dwelling. Birth and age and death are the fate of the physical, and all physical changes from childhood onward of the physical body only are caste and grade, with their many homes, and differences of worship and dishonor, and great honor belong to it alone. The powers of knowing, hearing, touch, sight, smell, taste, for apprehending sensuous things. The powers of doing, voice, hands, feet, the powers that put forth and generate, to effect deeds. Then the inward activity, mind, soul, self-assertion, imagination with their proper powers, mind ever intending and doubting, soul with its character of certainty as to things, self-assertion that falsely attributes the notion of I, imagination, with its power of gathering itself together and directing itself to its object. These also are the life breaths, the forward life, the downward life, the distributing life, the uniting life. Their activities and forms are different as gold and water are different. The subtle vesture they call the eightfold inner being made up of thus: voice, and the other four, hearing, and the other four, ether, and the other four, the forward life and the other four, soul, and the other inward activities, on wisdom, desire, and action. Hear now about this subtle vesture or form vesture born of elements not five-folded. It is the place of gratification, the enjoyer of the fruits of deeds, the beginningless disguise of the self through lack of self-knowledge. Dream life is the mode of its expansion, where it shines with reflected light through the traces of its own impressions. For in dream life, the knowing soul shines of itself through the many and varied mind pictures made during waking life. Here the higher self shines of itself and rules, taking on the condition of doer, with pure thought as its disguise, an unaffected witness, nor is it stained by the actions there done, as it is not attached to them. Therefore it is not stained by actions, whatever they be, done by its disguise. Let this form vesture be the minister, doing the work of the conscious self, the real man, just as the tools do the carpenter's work. Thus, this self remains unattached. Blindness or slowness or skill come from the goodness or badness of the eye. Deafness and dumbness are of the ear, not of the knower, the self. Up-breathing, down-breathing, yawning, sneezing, the forward moving of breath and the outward moving, these are the doings of the life breaths. Say those who know these things, and of the life breaths also, hunger and thirst are properties. The inner activity dwells and shines in sight and the other powers in the body through the false attribution of selfhood as cause. Self-assertion is to be known as the cause of this false attribution of selfhood, as doer and enjoyer, and through substance, the other two potencies, it reaches expansion in the three modes. When sensuous things have affinity with it, it is happy. When the contrary, unhappy. So happiness and unhappiness are properties of this and not of the self, which is perpetual bliss. Sensuous things are dear for the sake of the self and not for their own sake, and therefore the self itself is dearest of all. Hence, the self itself is perpetual bliss. Not for it are happiness and unhappiness. As in dreamless life, where are no sensuous things, the self that is bliss is enjoyed. So in waking life it is enjoyed through the word, through intuition, teaching, and deduction. The Three Potencies. The power of the Supreme Master that is called unmanifested, beginningless wisdom, whose very self is the Three Potencies, to be known through thought by its workings. This is glamour, maya, whereby all this moving world is made to grow. Neither being nor non-being, nor the self of both of these, neither divided nor undivided, nor of the self of both of these, neither form nor formless, nor of the self of both of these. Very wonderful and ineffable is its form, to be destroyed by the awakening to the pure, secondless, eternal, as the serpent imagined in a rope when the rope is seen. Its potencies are called substance, force, and darkness, each of them known by their workings. The self of doing belongs to force, whose power is extension, whence the pre-existent activities issued. Rage and all the changes of the mind that cause sorrow are ever its results. Desire, wrath, greed, vanity, malice, self-assertion, jealousy, envy are the terrible works of force, its activities in man. Therefore this is the cause of bondage. Then enveloping is the power of darkness, whereby a thing appears as something else. This is the cause of the circling birth and rebirth of the spirit, and the cause whereby extension is drawn forward. Though a man may be full of knowledge, learned, skillful, very subtle-sighted, if darkness has wrapped him round, he sees not. Though he be full of manifold instruction, he calls good that which is raised by air, and leans upon its properties, unlucky man that he is. Great and hard to end is the enveloping power of darkness. Wrong thinking, contradictory thinking, fanciful thinking, confused thinking, these are its workings. This power of extension never leaves hold of one who has come into contact with it, but perpetually sends him this way and that. Unwisdom, sluggishness, inertness, sloth, infatuation, folly, and things like these are of the potency of darkness. Under the yoke of these he knows nothing at all, but remains as though asleep or like a post. But the potency of substance is pure like water, and even though mixed with the other two, it builds for the true refuge, for it is a reflected spark of the self and lights up the inert like the sun. Of the potency of substance, when mixed, the properties are self-respect, self-restraint, control, faith and love, and the longing to be free. A godlike power and a turning back from the unreal. Of the potency of substance altogether pure, the properties are grace, direct procession of the self and perfect peace, exalting gladness, resting on the Supreme Self, whereby he reaches the essence of real bliss. The unmanifest is characterized by these three potencies. It is the casual vesture of the self. Dreamless life is the mode where it lives freely. All the activities of the powers and even the knowing soul have sunk back into it. Every form of outward perceiving has come to rest. This knowing soul becomes latent in the self from which it springs. The name of this is Dreamless Life, wherein he says, I know nothing at all of the noise of the moving world. The body, powers, life, breaths, mind, self-assertion, all changes, sensuous things, happiness, unhappiness, the ether, and all the elements, the whole world up to the unmanifest. This is not the self. Glamour, and every work of glamour, from the world soul to the body, know this as unreal, as not the self, built up of the mirage of the desert. But I shall declare to you the own being of the Self Supreme, knowing which a man, freed from his bonds, reaches the lonely purity. There is a certain selfhood, wherein the sense of I forever rests, who witnesses the three modes of being, who is other than the five veils, who is the only knower in waking, dreaming, dreamlessness, of all the activities of the knowing soul, whether good or bad. This is the I, who of himself beholds all, whom none beholds, who kindles to consciousness the knowing soul and all the powers, whom none kindles to consciousness, by whom all this is filled, whom no other fills, who is the shining light within this all, after whose shining all else shines, by whose nearness only body and powers and mind and soul do their work, each in its own field, as though sent by the Self. Because the own nature of this eternal wakefulness, self-assertion, the body and all the powers and happiness and unhappiness are beheld by it, just as an earthen pot is beheld. The inner self, the ancient spirit, is everlasting, partless, immediately experienced happiness, ever of one nature, pure waking knowledge, sent forth by whom voice and the life breaths move. Here, verily, in the substantial self, in the hidden place of the soul, this steady shining begins to shine like the dawn. Then the shining shines forth as the noonday sun, making all this world to shine by its inherent light, knower of all the changing moods of the mind and inward powers, of all the acts done by body powers, life breaths, present in them, as fire in iron, strives not nor changes at all. This is not born, nor dies, nor grows, nor does it fade or change forever. Even when this form has melted away, it no more melts than the air in a jar. Alike stranger to forming and deforming, of its own being, pure wakefulness, both being and non-being is this. Besides it, there is nothing else. This shines unchanging, this supreme self gleams in waking, dream, and dreamlessness as I, present, as the witness of the knowing soul. Bondage and freedom. Then, holding firmly mind, with knowing soul at rest, know yourself within yourself, face to face, saying, This am I. The life ocean whose waves are birth and dying is shoreless. Cross over it, fulfilling the end of being, resting firm in the eternal. Thinking things not self are I. This is bondage for a man. This arising from unwisdom is the cause of falling into the weariness of birth and dying. This is the cause that he feeds and anoints and guards this form, thinking it the self, the unreal real, wrapping himself in sensuous things as a silkworm in his own threads. The thought that what is not that is that grows up in the fool through darkness, because no discernment is there. It wells up as the thought that a rope is a snake. Thereupon a mighty multitude of fatuities fall on him who accepts this error. For he who grasps the unreal is bound. Mark this, my companion. By the power of wakefulness, partless, external, secondless, the self wells up with its endless lordship. But this enveloping power wraps it round, born of darkness, as the dragon of eclipse envelops the rayed sun. When the self with its stainless light recedes, a man thinking this body is I calls it the self. Then by lust and hate and all the potencies of bondage, the great power of force that they call extension greatly afflicts him. Torn by the gnawing of the toothed beast of great delusion, wandered from the self, accepting every changing mood of mind as himself, through this potency, in the shoreless ocean of birth and death, full of the poison of sensuous things, sinking and rising, he wanders, mean-minded, despicable-minded. as a line of clouds born of the sun's strong shining expands before the sun and hides it from sight, so self-assertion that has come into being through the self expands before the self and hides it from sight. As when on an evil day the Lord of Day is swallowed up in thick dark clouds, an ice-cold hurricane of wind, very terrible, afflicts the clouds in turns. So when the self is enveloped in impenetrable darkness, the keen power of extension dries with many afflictions the man whose soul is deluded. From those two powers a man's bondage comes. Deluded by them he errs, thinking the body is the self. Of the plant of birth and death, the seed is darkness. The sprout is the thought that body is self. The shoot is rage. The sap is deeds. The body is the stem. The life breaths are the branches. The tops are the bodily powers. Sensuous things are the flowers. Sorrow is the fruit born of varied deeds and manifold. And the life is the bird that eats the fruit. This bondage to what is not self, rooted in unwisdom, innate, made manifest without beginning or end, gives life to the falling torrent of sorrow, of birth and death, of sickness and old age. Not by weapons nor arms, not by storm nor fire, nor by a myriad of deeds can this be cut off, without the sword of discernment and knowledge, very sharp and bright, through the grace of the guiding power. He who is single-minded, fixed on the word divine, his steadfast fulfillment of duty will make the knowing soul within him pure. To him whose knowing soul is pure, a knowing of the Self Supreme shall come, and through this knowledge of the Self Supreme he shall destroy this circle of birth and death and its root together,